Welcome back to Invisible Capital. I'm your host, Lee Gibbs, and in this season, we're diving into emerging technologies amid the pandemic. Our last episode examined COVID's impact on how we shop for groceries, and producer Jen Germain and I had a fascinating conversation with Jason Goldberg while producing that story.
I'm recording. Are you recording, Jason?
I did.
Great.
I heard that you were already recording, so I hit record as well to try
Awesome.
to have a similar length.
Great. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to do a quick little clap there.
Jason is the Chief Strategy Officer at the agency holding company Publicis Groupe, and is also co-host of the e-commerce podcast, The Jason and Scott Show. There was far too much to squeeze into an episode that focused on order fulfillment, but we thought that this interview provided some additional context about the evolution of the retail landscape during the pandemic. We hope you enjoy this conversation and join us next week for a look at ghost kitchens and restaurant delivery tech. Well, welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Yeah, thrilled to be here.
So we want to dive into a few areas. We're on our path through emerging technology spaces. And one of the areas that we want to stop and take a hard look at is this kind of grocery and food space that has experienced a lot of change since the beginning of COVID-19. And we'd love to get a bit of your take today and dive in specifically into what's been described as micro-fulfillment and dark stores. But before we do that, why don't we just take a step back and give a lot of our listeners a sense of this kind of grocery industry? What do you think are 2 or 3 kind of key impacts that COVID-19 has had on food and grocery?
To me, 2 of the biggest impacts of COVID specifically on the grocery industry is number 1, the shift in where consumers get their calories. So pre-COVID, you'd get about 60% of your calories in North America from a grocery store, and you'd get about 40% of your calories from a restaurant or on the go. And obviously, during COVID, most of us are getting more than 90% of our calories from a grocery store. So that has had all sorts of pronounced impacts on everything, both the demand and supply chain to those grocery stores and how the goods are sold and how people shop. So that's one big impact. At the same time, people are less comfortable going to grocery stores, and there's more health concerns about going to grocery stores. So we've had this huge acceleration of the amount of groceries that are sold digitally. So before COVID in the US, depending on how you counted, you might say there were 2 to 3% of all grocery sales happened online. At the peak of COVID, there might have been 35% of all grocery sales that happened online. It's kind of normalized down now in the teens, so maybe we call it 15% today. But that's a level of digital penetration in grocery that a lot of people forecasted might have happened by 2025 or even 2030, depending on whose forecast you look at. So you can kind of think of COVID as accelerating digital grocery shopping 5 or 10 years in the future overnight. So that's a big impact. So the combination of those 2 things, that we're getting way more of our calories from shopping than we used to, and that we're doing a lot more of that shopping online than we're used to, feel like the 2 biggest impacts of COVID on the food space.
So, that's a really insightful statistic that you're remarking there. At the height of COVID, around 35% of that grocery purchasing happening online. And to your point, that's an acceleration of a decade or more for this smaller industry. I wonder how it is that grocery retailers are really kind of adapting in this new environment. What are the types of opportunities that they're trying to take advantage of?
On the one hand, retailers are thrilled, right? Like, they may not want to say this, but every grocer is thrilled to be getting 90% of the stomach instead of 60% of the stomach. And so, one of the things that's not talked about a lot, but is happening very aggressively right now, is every grocer in the world is trying to figure out how to lock that in. Once COVID is over, knock on wood that one day it's over, and people are comfortable returning to restaurants, grocers would like to retain 70% of that stomach or 80% of that stomach. So, one trend that grocers are leaning into is trying to turn these temporary measures into permanent habits on the part of the consumer. A huge impact of the demand shifting to digital is that very few grocers were prepared to manage that spike in volume, right? So if you were a progressive digital retailer, let's say Walmart or Kroger, you had a grocery app before COVID, right? And in Walmart's case, like 25 million people use that app. And there's a whole team at Walmart whose whole job was to get more people to download that app. Well, good news. 75 million people downloaded that app in a week, right? So on the one hand, high five, like those people all made their KPI. On the other hand, oh no, all these new people are trying our digital grocery shopping experience for the first time. And it's the absolute worst version of this digital shopping experience we've ever offered, right? We don't have any delivery windows. We're completely out of toilet paper. You're likely to order peanut butter and get glue sticks delivered instead. You're certainly not going to get your first choice of brands. That guy's not going to show up when they promised, and they're going to be missing a bunch of the products. So the first challenge all these retailers had is huge influx of digital shopping. How do we scale our capacity and harden our system so that we give a reliable and good experience to those grocery shoppers? And we saw some Herculean efforts. Amazon wasn't delivering groceries out of a bunch of their Whole Food stores prior to COVID, but they pretty quickly pivoted to turning every Whole Food store into a distribution hub. A lot of grocers had very limited curbside capability, and they quickly pivoted. There were grocers that hadn't leaned into digital very much, and they quickly reached out to Instacart or whomever to augment their delivery capability. So you suddenly saw a bunch of old established companies that historically had been pretty slow moving get really entrepreneurial and sort of agile to quickly respond to this. I hate throwing out buzzwords, but in the case of COVID, they often fit, like unprecedented paradigm shift. I get paid a lot as a consultant to say words like that. So that's.
Well, thanks for the insight. Just to slow down briefly a minute so that our listeners can stay with us. I mean, you're citing challenges not only about adoption, which got solved really quick, huge surge in adoption, but as those users are leveraging online purchasing, there was the supply chain challenges that the grocers had to deal with that we heard a lot about as the pandemic hit early on, and the distribution challenges, and then the efficiency around maybe the last mile delivery, to get it to people. And not to mention, hey, does the app actually function from a technology standpoint? That's a lot to overcome in a very compressed amount of time. I guess part of what I'm getting at here is, you mentioned a few of those larger brands that had the customer base in place. Walmart is a great example. Kroger was there developing some of their work. And we've seen a lot of activity in the solutions that Amazon is providing. That's big scale. And they have those resources to address the challenges. Take us down to maybe the smaller scale, the mom and pop, the local grocers. How have they perhaps tried to pursue solutions in this time of unprecedented grocery shopping, as you mentioned?
So a great question, because a significant portion of the overall grocery fleet in the U.S. is still independent grocers or small regional grocers. And that's less true in other categories. Like, there's not a ton of independent consumer electronics retailers left. It is still true in grocery. And the sad fact is the biggest impact COVID has on those independents is it puts them out of business, right? Like grocery is a difficult business. It's an extremely low margin business. The average independent retailer in the U.S., which includes grocery stores, had 19 days of cash on hand when COVID hit, right? So if you were in a place where you felt you had to close, which fortunately for many grocery stores, they were the exception to the rule and didn't have to close. But if you felt like you were forced to close for the safety of your employees or your customers, and you had to have a significant revenue impact for 19 days, you were likely insolvent, right? When the supply chain issues started hitting all these grocery stores, the large chains with buying power and leverage over the suppliers were the disproportionate winners, right? Albertsons was going to get toilet paper before a mom and pop grocery store was going to get toilet paper from that supplier. And so, one of the really unfortunate impacts of COVID on the grocery industry is it likely put a bunch of independent grocers out of business and shifted their volume to the big established, more well-funded players. So before COVID, the largest three grocers in the United States, Walmart, Kroger, and Albertsons, probably represented about 40% of all grocery sales. After COVID and after all these independents have closed and that volume has shifted, it's very likely that those same three grocers represent 62% of all grocery sales. It's a huge gift to those large grocers that both were kind of already digitally prepared, got classified as essential and had the economic means to stay open and capture share in this situation.
So in the context of groceries kind of transition to e-commerce as well, there are or have been, a few kind of up and coming segments. And that's part of what we really want to dive more deeply into today. I mentioned micro fulfillment and dark stores as a few examples. So before pandemic times, one of the largest obstacles for grocery delivery, or any delivery for that matter, was kind of solving the last mile challenge, right? There are large distribution hubs, there's regional distribution hubs, but then how do we actually get it to the consumer at their doorstep? Two segments that have emerged in the realm of retail to address this are what is being referred to as micro-fulfillment and dark stores. So Jason, maybe before we go any further, perhaps we can provide listeners a quick explanation of what those two spaces are and what their relationship is to one another.
Sure. So micro-fulfillment centers, sometimes we call them MFCs, are automated product picking centers that are designed to support a small geographic area, like typically the same area that an individual grocery store might serve. Instead of putting all the products on shelves and having customers pick their own groceries, I would put all those groceries in individual bins in a automated picking system, and I would fulfill a grocery order by having a robot kind of pull all the products out of those bins and then aggregate them in a set of bags to put in a customer's trunk or to drive to a customer's house. So micro-fulfillment centers use a robot to pick products and aggregate an order instead of a shopper walking around a store. And what a dark store is it's a store designed for professional pickers instead of customers. So normally we invite customers to come in our stores. They walk up and down the aisles. They put all the products in their cart. They pay for them and they drive them home. If that customer is going to have the groceries loaded in their car for a curbside pickup, or they're going to have the groceries delivered to their door, then one way to do that is to have pickers competing with customers in the live store. And everyone listening to this has probably experienced that when they've gone shopping at Whole Foods and they're elbow to elbow with a bunch of Amazon employees that are picking orders for other customers, or maybe you went to another grocer that you were competing with Instacart pickers to grab that last bunch of bananas off the shelf. For a variety of reasons, that's inefficient. Number one, the real customers in the store don't like it. Like they don't like the extra congestion and having to compete for products. And it's actually really inefficient for the professional pickers, because the way we design a store for customers is we want customers to wander and discover as many products as possible. So the store layout is quite inefficient in order to maximize the amount of purchase decisions a consumer will make. But if you're exclusively having professional pickers, what you'd want is the most popular, most in-demand products you'd want in the front of the store with the shortest reach time, and you'd want the least popular products to be the furthest away. So the way you assort the products might be wildly different in a store that was designed for a professional picker. So what a dark store is, the metaphor is the lights are turned off. I can assure you all the pickers are allowed to have the lights on. But it's a store that's not open to the public and exists solely to optimize picking for grocery delivery. And in many cases, it was once a live customer store that got converted for that purpose. And that's where the dark store metaphor comes from, is the store went dark. Today, a lot of dark stores might have been built from the ground up intentionally to be these local fulfillment hubs.
And because they aren't consumer facing or necessarily built for consumers, we don't see them, driving around or walking, or they're not on our Google Maps as an option to go and shop at. But a number of grocery brands have obviously launched dark stores in the midst of the pandemic. I guess notable examples might be Whole Foods, who recently opened one of their first dark stores in Brooklyn to meet fulfillment demands there. Amazon opened their first kind of brick and mortar Amazon Fresh also in LA, which is a little bit of a different model. So I'm just wondering, how prevalent do you think these dark stores are within the grocery industry at this point?
Yeah, well, let me unpack that a little bit, and then I'll tell you how prevalent I think they are. But you're exactly right. If it's a pure dark store, it's not designed to attract customer attention. So it's not signed or flagged. It doesn't have a huge voluminous parking lot for consumers. And originally, there was this notion that like the zoning of the land that you would rent or buy for these things would be different, right? An odd trend at the moment, grocery aside, e-commerce is booming so much that for the first time in the history of the United States, warehouse space is actually more expensive and more constrained than retail space at the moment. So the normal dynamics of that rent are sort of disrupted. We'll see if that sustains or not. But that's one effect of the dark stores. And dark stores are more prevalent than people might think. So, for example, this first dark store that Whole Foods opened in Brooklyn is actually not Whole Foods' first dark store. It's probably their first purpose-built dark store. So when the pandemic first started, Whole Foods made a strategic decision to close certain stores in markets and exclusively use those stores as dark stores. They made a decision to optimize capacity, and they were seeing so much demand for delivery, and they wanted to get more delivery slots available that, if they had 2 stores in a 5-mile radius in Chicago, they might have kept one open to focus on consumers' self-serve shopping, and they might have closed the other and temporarily converted it into a dark store. So that kind of play happened by a bunch of retailers. Amazon was pretty open about doing that. Another interesting thing is Amazon had a new grocery concept that was scheduled to open in LA, and that's the store you referred to as the Amazon Fresh store. And it was actually scheduled to open about the time that COVID hit in March or April. And what they did with that store is they delayed its consumer opening. In fact, it's really just open now to the general public. And for several months, they used that store exclusively as a dark store for deliveries. It can be common that you might convert a live store to a dark store to kind of grow your delivery capacity as your demand shifts from self-service grocery shoppers to delivery grocery shoppers. Stores building dedicated dark stores is rapidly growing, but I would say less common at the moment because there's some controversy over whether that's the best model. There's a lot of debate amongst grocery economists about what the right model is for profitably supporting digital grocery sales.
And to take this back to the original problem, looking in from the outside, one might think, oh, well, building new stores entirely, is rather capital intensive. Or converting stores or shutting stores down, also capital intensive, and could one miss out on potential gains? But part of what you had mentioned earlier in describing the problem was that these grocery stores in general, what we know to be the stores that we shop at, are just simply not built for holding inventory and organizing delivery orders in this way. Correct me if I'm wrong, in a given grocery store, the vast majority of the square footage is devoted to giving consumers the opportunity to walk around aisles. Very little is actually devoted to keeping inventory in the back of the store.
Yeah, so and in fact, a long trend in grocery had been to eliminate the storage room and have 100% of the inventory on the shelves. Because over the long history of grocery, grocers started out with 100% of the inventory behind the counter. If any of your listeners are old enough to have ever watched Little House on the Prairie, the Olsons ran the general store in that town. And what you did is you walked up to Mr. Olson with your list, and he would go in the back and get all your products for you. And that's how general merchants worked.
Personalized shopping.
Yeah, exactly. And there were a lot of benefits to that, right? Like if you changed your list, you had to explain to Mr. Olson why you changed it. And so he could change his supply chain based on, learning that you were buying less sugar or something like that. A grocer in the 30s invented this concept of, we could make a lot more money if we taught the customers how to get their own products off the shelf. And so this is a grocer called Piggly Wiggly, which is just the funnest name in all of retail to say.
I remember Piggly Wiggly. I grew up in the Midwest with Piggly Wiggly.
Yeah, so they were the first retailer to invent what we today call open sell, meaning letting customers pick their own products off the shelf. And so the theory was you had to have one Mr. Olson per customer to go get those orders, right? Whereas if you had 30 customers that were all filling their own orders, you could service many more customers at the same time. As the population in the U.S. was exploding, retailers had to reinvent how they served those customers. And so we kind of went from this one-to-one model to this self-service model pioneered by Piggly Wiggly, but pretty quickly adopted by everyone else. And that fundamentally changed a bunch of things. If all the products were in the warehouse and you were just talking to the clerk, the words printed on the package had no impact on your buying decisions. But, once stores became self-service, all of that packaging material suddenly became billboards for our advertising, right? And it became super important. The art that we put on that Campbell soup to entice you, the benefits we put about on the products, all of these things shifted when customers suddenly had to shop for their own groceries. So that happened. And increasingly, stores started out by having inventory in the back and a few products on the shelf. But what would happen is the customers would take all the products off the shelf and the clerk wouldn't be really fast at restocking the products from the back to the shelf. And so what would happen is a customer wouldn't buy something because it looked out of stock to them, even though there was inventory that no one could buy in the back of the store. And so that was a very expensive lost opportunity for grocery stores. At its peak, it was estimated that something like 20% of all out of stocks were false out of stocks because they were in the store, just not on the shelf where the customer expected them. And so to address that over time, grocers have shrunk their back of house and expanded the customer-facing shelves to be the whole store. So today, a optimized grocer might be very efficient at receiving stuff in a receiving dock, breaking up the pallets and putting all the product on the shelf and having no inventory space in the back of the store. So that's kind of where we were pre-COVID. And per your point, the kind of success criteria a store would have would be things like dwell time. How long does the customer stay in the store? And longer is better, right? And how many new products would they discover? If Campbell's wanted to launch a new brand of soup, the best way to market it is to put it on the shelf next to the popular brand of soup, right? And people would go to get the popular soup and they'd see the new flavor and they might be enticed to try it. The stores were really designed around holding customers in and having them discover as many unplanned purchases as possible. Typically, people don't put Oreos on their shopping list. It's an impulse buy. Often the most valuable space in a grocery store is the cash wrap. It's the gum and the individual cans of soda, or old school, the magazines that were staring at eye level while you were waiting in line to pay for your groceries, right? And you didn't know you wanted gum, but when the Wrigley pack was staring at you, you'd get that Juicy Fruit for the ride home, or you'd get that can of Coke to drink on the way home from the grocery store. Those unplanned impulse sales were huge, and that's what the store was really designed to be good at. If you were building a fulfillment center that a customer doesn't go to, what you'd optimize it for is picks per minute. Like how fast can you fulfill those orders? How efficient can those people be? How many orders can you fulfill out of a single square foot of fulfillment center space? And so that's why a perfect dark store would be designed very differently than a perfect store for a customer. The main appeal of a dark store is if the retail store is really well designed, it's very inefficient for picking. And so it's expensive to pay professional pickers to pick out of that live store. They'd be far more efficient if they could pick out of a dark store.
Describing how inventory comes into what we know as a grocery store. I imagine that COVID presented a new or unique challenge in that, that supply chain was not always reliable, right? Knowing that, okay, if something wasn't coming in the door, we would have empty shelf space and therefore unused square footage within a grocery store as we know it today, potentially losing dollars.
Exactly. So if you think about it, as we shrink the back of house space in that grocery store, we get more dependent on what we call a just-in-time model. I want new toilet paper to show up right before I run out of the old toilet paper. And increasingly, we're using artificial intelligence and big data to anticipate that supply. And in general, that worked pretty well. Like grocery stores sell a predictable amount of toilet paper. And so the manufacturers could make it. As everyone is painfully familiar, we had a toilet paper shortage at the beginning of COVID. that was not because people were using more toilet paper, but people irrationally had a significant fear of running out of toilet paper, so they bought more, they stocked more at home, what we call pantry stuffing. And toilet paper was kind of the first example of this, but it shifted to shelf-stable dry goods. Like everyone was buying bigger packs of soup and dried pasta and peanut butter and things because they wanted to hedge against future disruptions in the supply chain, meaning that you didn't have peanut butter to feed your kids. So when that demand spiked, there are lots of manufacturing facilities in the US that know how to make toilet paper, but toilet paper is not very expensive and it takes a lot of space. So it's really inefficient to make a ton of toilet paper and pay to store it somewhere. So in general, the toilet paper comes out of the paper mill exactly at the quantity that they anticipated consumers would consume it. And it gets delivered to the store right before they sell out so they could restock that shelf, right? Like there just wasn't a lot of safety stock in the supply chain. There was no room in the back of the stores. There was no room at the toilet paper warehouse. We had this highly efficient, just-in-time manufacturing process. And that served everyone well when everything was going perfect. But as soon as we have some unusual event like COVID disrupting that supply chain, it completely fell on its face, right? Suddenly, like, we couldn't use the historical data to anticipate that supply. So now mills had to, speed up their production, which they had the capacity to do, but there was economic risk there. And someone had to approve doing something that the data didn't support. And so that played out, times 100. Most tragically in the food supply, remember our premise that 60% of calories went from grocery stores, 40% went from restaurants. That meant 40% of the dairies were expecting to sell their milk to a restaurant. And the package that you would deliver that milk in for a restaurant is very different than the package that you put the milk in to put in a refrigerator in a grocery store, right? So we had this tragedy. You had dairies that were optimized for selling to restaurants that suddenly had no customer for their milk. And they're throwing away the milk. They're dumping it because it was going to turn bad. There was no way to store it, and there was no way to sell it. And you had grocery stores that couldn't get enough milk to sell all their supply, right? And that was largely because of the different delivery mechanism between the grocery use case and the restaurant use case. So, like, over time, dairies pivoted, right? Like, the restaurant dairy learned how to put milk in cartons to sell to grocery stores, and the grocery stores learned to find some of those previous restaurant suppliers and add them to their supply chain. So over time, things improved, but there were some egregious early examples of, the supply and demand really getting out of whack because of that.
And to be clear, for listeners that aren't familiar, I mean, that was a real problem that dairy farms all over the country faced earlier this year. Funny's not the right word, but interesting to hear you say it in that way, that in time, dairy farms have evolved their practice in order to package this differently. But that's just been in a matter of months. They've had to adapt quickly to make sure that they don't literally have product spoiling on the farm because they just can't get it in the right container.
Yeah, and you can imagine it definitely still is not perfect. If you were one of those dairies that mainly sold to restaurants, you tried to pivot to selling to grocery stores, should I just be trying to hang on until my restaurant customer comes back? Or are a bunch of my restaurant customers permanently out of business and they're never going to come back? I'm glad I don't make my living solving all those problems because they're very hairy.
Well, let's understand a few more of those problems. Earlier, we scratched the surface on micro-fulfillment and exactly what that was. And as you described it, images of a vending machine were just going through my mind, right? We've tapped in our order online, and an automated process is going to go out to the shelves and it's going to collect my order in one place.
Most people tend to picture a robot that moves around to all these different shelves and grabs it, like that vending machine with the robotic arm.
Exactly.
In practice, most of these are the opposite of that. The shelves are robotic and move to the arm.
Okay, so a little bit of what we've seen Amazon do with some of their warehouses.
Exactly. The Kiva robot that Amazon uses. If you were a general merchant, if you were selling televisions or sporting goods equipment, like, you probably already had an automated fulfillment center for your e-commerce. There are these popular systems, Perfect Pick and Auto Store. They all have bins that hold products and then conveyor belts that would go grab the right bins and pull them up front so that a person could package your e-commerce order. And so these grocery micro-fulfillment centers are the slightly scaled down, because the items are smaller, food versions of these general merchandising systems. I mean, some of them have robots that go around, and maybe it's a distinction without a difference. It is very cool tech. One of the benefits of the bins moving instead of the arms is you can stack a bunch of bins on top of each other and you can get more product density in the same amount of space.
We're describing this as it's been coined as micro-fulfillment. I mean, give us a sense, though, of how large a facility are we referring to, and what would this space actually look like?
A big grocery store, a very big grocery store might be, a superstore might be like 40 or 50,000 square feet. An entire Walmart is like 100 to 120, 130,000 square feet, but that includes a lot of non-grocery stuff. A Whole Foods might be 40,000 square feet. More typical Albertsons might be 20,000 square feet. The typical micro-fulfillment center that's designed to live in the back of a grocery store or in the parking lot of a grocery store tend to be 5 to 10,000 square feet. The thing to think about is, if I'm going to augment a store with automated picking capability, I'm going to add a micro-fulfillment center to that store. And that's where the MFC comes in. And the amount of space it takes is critical, because if it goes in the parking lot, I'm giving up parking spaces for it. If it goes in the back of store, I'm giving up shelves that formerly sold products to customers for it. So adding a micro-fulfillment capability to a live store, which is most commonly how micro-fulfillment centers are used right now, the space is a huge priority. And so their efficiency is huge. When we talk about dark stores, that's turning that whole 20,000 square foot store into a picking center. Both a micro-fulfillment center and a dark store serve the amount of customers that live around one store. So maybe that's 20,000 households or 10,000 households. Another model is a regional distribution model. Like, let's put the food in a much bigger, more automated warehouse that holds way more and expect people to drive further to do deliveries. The famous grocer in the US with that model is Kroger. So they partnered with a UK digital grocer called Ocado. And Ocado has this model where they use dedicated warehouses that they call sheds. Kroger's building 3 or 4 of these. They're each over 1 million square feet. So way huger. Instead of serving 10,000 families, they're intended to serve 100,000 families. And the thought is they can hold more stuff. They can be more efficient for the picking, but the delivery costs are going to be higher because you're going to have to drive the groceries further away. The micro-fulfillment center is, hey, they can serve way less customers, but they can cost-effectively be put way closer to the customer. So this is a great debate in efficiency. Is it better to have big things that are sparsely populated or little things that are densely populated? In the analogy of e-commerce, if you look at like what Amazon's answer was for general merchandise, it's both. They have fulfillment centers that are millions of square feet that they do a bunch of deliveries out, and increasingly they're moving smaller warehouses closer to the customer to augment those.
And now efficiency is certainly one consideration with that, but if I'm hearing you correctly, with those two different models, we're somewhat solving for a different need. With the larger scale Kroger model that you mentioned, we're really relying on that to be a delivery end of point for the customer. Whereas your micro-fulfillment, as you mentioned, being on-site, that might be a curbside pickup model where I'm driving to my familiar neighborhood grocer. Oh, and if I forget something, I could run inside and grab that one thing, but I'm out and maybe doing a few errands anyway. So curbside's going to be the solution that we might be solving for there.
Potentially. You are bringing up a great point. So a huge problem in digital grocery that we haven't talked about yet, that is a perfect time to bring up, is the profitability of digital grocery. Pre-digital, when a shopper gets groceries, the shopper does 2 very helpful things for the retailer. They pick all the products, so the retailer doesn't have to pay to put all the products in the cart because the customer does that. And then they drive all the products home. So they do the delivery, right? So when you look at the difference between a self-service grocery store and a home delivery grocery experience, the home delivery grocer has to pay for 2 huge costs. They have to pay the picking costs, and they have to pay the delivery costs. And pre-COVID, what we had seen in the US is customers love digital grocery as long as they didn't have to pay anything extra for it. So when Instacart would subsidize the cost and they'd launch in a market and the prices would be at parity with traditional grocery stores, adoption was very high. As soon as the grocers tried to recover some of those extra costs that digital grocery have, like picking and delivery, the customer wasn't very interested in digital grocery and adoption went way down. COVID has slightly changed that calculus, but in general, the customer doesn't want to pay for either of those things. So pre-COVID digital grocery stores like Fresh Direct in New York or Peapod or traditional grocers leaning into digital like Whole Foods and Walmart and Kroger, they all lost money often on that digital grocery order. And when that was only 2% of their sales, that wasn't a big deal. The thought was, when the amount of digital sales go up, we'll figure out how to optimize this. Right now, we just want to get customers, and we don't want those bastards at Amazon stealing that customer from us, right? So we're going to compete for the customer and not worry a heck of a lot about the profitability. When COVID hit, and suddenly 1 or 2% grocery sales became 15% or 35%. Oh my God, the difference in profitability between digital and in-store became a huge deal, right? Like if you were Walmart and you're saying, wait, if permanently 15% of our customers are going to be doing digital grocery, we've got to find a way to make this profitable. This will be a real material impact to our profitability, right? And so you go, all right, let's attack the two costs. Delivery costs and picking costs. Well, one way you can make the picking costs lower, you can go to a dark store, because as we talked about, that can be more efficient. If a professional picker in a consumer store can pick 4 orders an hour while they're fighting with customers, if you go to a dark store, that professional picker might be able to pick 10 or 15 orders an hour because the product adjacencies are much better and they can be much more efficient. The robot can pick 60 orders an hour, right? So the cost of the automated picking is about 1/10 the cost of a human picker. So if you're a digital grocer, you go, oh man, I want automated picking. That can save me a ton. Now, 2 downsides to that. It takes space that you have to give up, that space was working hard for you in some other way, right? So either it was your selling space or your parking space, and it's much more capital intensive, right? Like if I hire 10 more people to pick in my store, that's an OpEx cost. But if I buy a $2 million micro fulfillment center, that's a CapEx cost, right? And so you have to be sufficiently capitalized to make that kind of investment to solve the picking problem. Now, the delivery problem. Delivery for grocery is a unique challenge. If you think about e-commerce deliveries for apparel, we use a system called a route-based delivery. Now, when I'm delivering milk, I've got a couple problems. The milk can't sit in the truck for 8 hours, or I need a way more expensive truck that can keep the milk cold. And someone has to be home at the exact moment that I deliver the milk because it can't sit on my porch for 8 hours. We used to have this thing in America called milkmen that did deliver milk. But back then, most families were single-income families, and there was someone home to receive that milk. Today, most families are 2-income families. Pre-COVID, that meant both parents were out of the house, and there was no one at home to receive the milk. So when we deliver perishable groceries, instead of being able to do a route, what we mostly have to do is a point delivery. That means load a specific customer's order on a truck, drive that truck straight to that consumer's home, in a narrow window when we promise to be there and when someone's home to receive those groceries and put them in the fridge. And so what that means is the cost per delivery for perishable groceries is wildly higher than the cost per delivery for a sweater. And part of that cost is what we had to eat in digital grocery. Now, if you're solving digital grocery in New York City, where a ton of people in a small area are ordering them, maybe there can be some economies of efficiency where you do still get to do routes and where you do enough deliveries that it's kind of efficient. But for most of America, we're more rural and the density between houses and the density of digital orders is much more Spartan. The delivery cost is really problematic. And so what most grocers in America have discovered is that customers are willing to do their own delivery. And customers found the convenience of curbside pickup for grocery to be huge. It's both Walmart and Kroger have said it's the highest net promoter score shopping experience they've ever offered. Kroger has said that for every customer that wants a home delivery, 5 customers want curbside pickup. So for most of America, with our residential density, the answer for digital grocery is not home delivery, even though most rich investors that live in Silicon Valley are picturing someone showing up at your doorstep with your organic milk. The scale solution for grocery really isn't home delivery. It's curbside pickup. That's the high volume play, and that solves the delivery problem. So if you're Walmart or Kroger, what you're saying is let's make picking more efficient by having automated picking, which is a micro-fulfillment center, and let's make delivery more efficient by having a great curbside pickup experience. And by bundling those two things, the premise is you can get the cost of digital grocery at parity or very close with the old self-service grocery, and now you can profitably serve all these customers that have become addicted to digital grocery. So that dark store is really helpful when we're doing home delivery. The dark store is not particularly helpful for curbside pickup. And so that's why the micro-fulfillment centers mostly aren't just designed to replace a dark store. They're designed to augment a real store. And that's why they take up parking space in the case of Walmart's model, or they take up shelf space in the case of Albertsons model.
Something that's been running through my head, though, as you're talking about some of this is on the curbside, are grocers then losing out on impulse buy profits? What, in your mind, is the new strategy around efficiencies as it relates to profitability around some of those like impulse buys that you might not get in these new scenarios?
So one of the problems we have with digital grocery is this problem of impulse buys, right? We design the whole store to get you to discover the Oreos and the gum and the things that you didn't put on your shopping list. When you become a digital shopper, you build a list the first time, and then you tend to reorder off that same list. Maybe you manicure that list a little bit, but you rarely just whimsically decide to add a new flavor of cookies to your shopping list. So if you're mainly in the business of selling impulse items, you're kind of screwed in digital grocery. Impulse items are very profitable, so grocers are rapidly trying to solve for what we call the digital impulse problem. So a couple ways we might do that. We might suggest more of those products during your digital shopping experience, right? And so most digital grocers have an interstitial after you say you're done shopping before you go to the cart, and they call it the top-off page, right? And they're like, hey, I noticed you forgot to add that pint of Haagen-Dazs that you usually buy. Or we show you impulse items or items related to the items you bought that maybe you want, and we try to get you to top off your cart. In the early days of digital, we might have avoided that top-off page because it's an extra step to shop, and every extra step caused drop-off. And so what we call that is like cart abandonment. No one wanted cart abandonment. As digital grocery becomes more economically significant, hey, I'll live with the cart abandonment. I need the orders I do get to be profitable. And so grocers are putting more suggestive selling in their shopping experiences. So that's one way we might partially solve for the impulse item. A big part of impulse items is a can of Coke you're going to buy during checkout to drink on the way home from the grocery store. Wasn't part of your list, but you just suddenly realized you had to have a can of Coke. So there, what I might do is have immediate consumption impulse items curbside. I might have a Coke vending machine or a menu of items I can add to my order right curbside when I'm doing my pickup experience. So that's a second place that we might add impulse items. When you walked around that grocery store, we fed you a lot. We gave you a lot of samples, and samples were super effective. You can't do sampling if you don't go in the store, and even if you do go in the store right now, we're mostly not doing sampling because no one wants you to pull down your mask and stuff your face with food. What we might replace for sampling is we might do what are called bag stuffers. Maybe I have a small size of a new flavor that I'm trying to get you to try, and I put it in your bag for free, so that when you get home and unpack your groceries, you discover that sample there. And maybe I have a QR code on that sample that if you scan it, it automatically manicures your list and adds that item to your shopping list for next time. So you kind of think about those 3 touch points. You think about the digital ordering experience, the curbside pickup experience, and the post-order unbagging experience are all places where we're experimenting with alternatives to traditional unplanned purchases. The jury's still out on which of those will work or what combination of those will become prevalent, but those are the kind of things we're trying. Another challenge of COVID is a lot of municipalities are restricting how many people are allowed in a store at a time. So in most places, that might be 25 or 50% of the maximum occupancy. That's a huge deal if you're a retailer. A retailer's primary metric is this thing called comps. How does this year's sales compare to last year's sales? And so in order to sell the same amount of stuff or more stuff to fewer people, you have to do two things. You have to either sell more stuff to each person that comes in your store, which, good news, COVID is sort of helping that anyway. People are making fewer visits and they're buying more in each visit. Or you have to sell stuff to people that don't come in your store, right? So not only do customers want digital grocery, but retailers want digital grocery because it's the only way they can get close to meeting their comps is they have to sell more stuff at curbside. And again, grocery retailers in particular really like the economics of curbside pickup much more than home delivery. We're seeing a lot of proactive measures to get customers to try curbside pickup. Google and their search engine have added new functionality to tell you which stores offer curbside pickup. At the peak of COVID, curbside pickup was up 300%. Now it's running at 200%. So curbside is the real go-to tactic for most retailers that are, hoping to get anywhere close to parity on their comps.
Now, if I were to kind of put my investor hat on, as I've listened to our conversation kind of go back and forth a little bit, one of the things that has really stood out to me is it sounds like as the industry continues to evolve or continues to try to find how this solution gets refined, it will be ripe for additional investment and additional acquisitions by a lot of these incumbents that are actively trying to put these solutions in place right now. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a very fair assessment. There's a ton of unknowns around the future of shopping and the long-term impact of COVID. But what's for sure is COVID's not going to magically go away and shopping's not going to revert to exactly how it was before. Those extra 50 million people that downloaded the Walmart grocery app are going to keep using the Walmart grocery app. And so a lot of those forced trials are going to be permanent digital shoppers. And so that means all of our job is to figure out how to make the unit economics work for that. But for sure, they're going to have to make significant investments to retool the entire chain of customer experience to accommodate this new realities of consumer behavior. And so there are going to be an opportunity for a lot of vendors to sell in those new solutions. The challenge, as I imagine it always is for investors, is going to be picking the winners from the losers.
Okay, so I'm also trying to understand when we have more of the larger brands anyway, like Kroger and, Amazon, I can get delivery through them, or Walmart, I can go directly to their app. As a consumer, what is the incentive for me to go through them directly versus going through Instacart or, some of the other competitors in that area that are coming up?
Instacart is a really interesting player in this whole ecosystem, right? So I've been in the e-commerce industry for a long time. To me, Instacart was very analogous to players that we saw in the very beginning of e-commerce. When consumers first started trying e-commerce, it was not economically meaningful to any retailer. So if you were a retailer and someone on your board said, hey, there's this new thing called e-commerce, we should try it. What you would not do is reorganize your whole company and make huge capital investments and solve for e-commerce at Best Buy or Toys R Us or Target. What you would do is you'd find some company that you could outsource a pilot to. And so in the early days of e-commerce, one of the companies that a bunch of these guys outsourced to was a company you may have now heard of called Amazon. Toys R Us and Target both said, oh yeah, Amazon, those kids seem good at this. It's wildly unprofitable. No one cares about it. So let's just pay Amazon to do it for us. And then Amazon started getting pretty big and it became meaningful, right? And so then the board's like, hey, why are you guys enabling our competitor by hiring them to do that? And they're like, oh, our bad. Sorry. Let's fire Amazon and hire someone else that won't compete with us. And in e-commerce, that was a company called GSI Commerce. I look at Instacart as the grocery equivalent to GSI Commerce. When grocers got asked to do e-commerce, they didn't want to build out this capability themselves. The easiest way to do it was to hire Instacart to do it for you. As it becomes bigger and more meaningful, pretty stupid to outsource a major part of your customer experience to a third party, particularly a third party that works with all your competitors and might themselves be your competitor. when shoppers buy from Instacart, they create an account not with Walmart, but with Instacart. And if Walmart ever said, you know what, we're not going to use Instacart anymore, we're going to do this ourselves, the first thing Instacart would do is do an email blast to all the people that used to get their groceries from Instacart Walmart and say, hey, do you guys know about Instacart Costco? Big grocers, were waking up to the fact that Instacart was very helpful for this one stage of our growth, but as this is becoming meaningful, we should not be dependent on someone, right? And so pre-COVID, I would have said, Instacart is going to have some challenges. I'm not saying they're going to go away, but they're going to have to pivot. And in my mind, they were. They were losing a lot of their big national accounts, and they were focusing more on regional accounts and independents, which I would have said was a smart play. In my GSI analogy, GSI still exists today. They've changed names a few times. They were owned by eBay, and today they're Radial. They provide a lot of services and make money facilitating e-commerce. They're not a turnkey outsourcer anymore, right? I would have said, oh, maybe Instacart will do the same. They'll be a fulfillment provider, but they won't be a outsourced marketplace like they are today. The dramatic need for more digital grocery capacity during COVID has given Instacart a huge second life, right? Like a lot of retailers that maybe were moving away are suddenly like, man, I need the capacity. Let's get more of it from Instacart. And there are other players like Instacart that are in a similar boat. So I think there definitely could be a potential for them as there's growth, but exactly how that plays out is pretty uncertain right now.
Well, this has been a really insightful discussion, Jason. Your perspective on this is deep, and we so appreciate you lending us some of your time today.
Yeah, this conversation's made me super hungry, so I'm gonna have to go raid the fridge.
Invisible Capital is a production of PitchBook. Executive produced by Kai Yao and Adley Bowden. Hosted by Lee Gibbs. This episode was produced and edited by Alison Sharoni. Audio mix and additional production support by Kai Yao. Cover art by Landon Early. Subscribe to Invisible Capital on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, visit pitchbook.com/podcast.